Midnight struck. Then it struck again, but no one touched the clock. Welcome to Vale Files. I am your host, Thorn. Say hi in the comments. Where are you watching from today? Your messages keep these mysteries alive. Let's dive in. It was on a drizzling Thursday evening in late October that I, Dr. John H. Watson, returned to Baker Street to find Sherlock Holmes seated in his usual position. Cross-legged upon the armchair, a slim volume of Horace in his hand, and a pipe curling tendrils of blue smoke into the already murky air. The coal fire hissed with damp cheer, casting flickering shadows across the books, chemical vials, and accumulated curiosities that marked Holmes's erratic, yet brilliant occupation of the flat. I had scarcely removed my coat when a soft but insistent knock came at the door below. Mrs. Hudson answered it, and a moment later a gentleman was ushered in. A man of middling height, rain-spattered and pale, his expression taut with that particular strain which only desperation can induce. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked, glancing nervously between us. Holmes did not rise, but his eyes brightened. "Pray come in. You have travelled from the north, I believe, and not in comfort." The man blinked. "Why, yes. I came from Yorkshire this morning, on the early train. Third class, judging by the dye from the felt hat band still upon your brow. A rather wet platform at York Station, and a porter in too much of a hurry. He's stained your right trouser leg with axle grease. Do be seated, sir. I see you are in distress." The visitor sat heavily, producing a folded envelope from the inside of his coat. "My name is Charles Dunsworthy. I am steward to the Marquis of Hartingford at Pendlebury House. There has been a death, Mr. Holmes, but not one we can properly explain." Holmes leaned forward. "Go on." "It was Lord Hartingford's brother Percival. He was found dead in the west drawing-room just after midnight 3 nights ago. At first glance it appeared natural. He had been unwell. But something is dreadfully wrong." "In what manner?" Dunsworthy licked his lips. "There is an old grandfather clock in that room. It has not chimed properly in years. Yet at the very stroke of midnight the servants heard it chime not once, but twice." Holmes gave a low hum, then turned to me. "Watson, you recall the case of the diabolical bell, do you not?" "I do," I said, frowning. "But that was a trick of resonance and an overheated boiler. Surely this—" "The clock struck twice?" Holmes interrupted, turning back to Dunsworthy. "2 chimes at midnight?" "Yes, 12, and then one more." Holmes stood abruptly. "A clock that insists it has not finished its work. Curious indeed." "There's more," Dunsworthy added quickly. "Lord Percival's expression when we found him was dreadful, as if he had died in shock, and there was a single spot of ink on his thumb, just one." Holmes paused, processing this. "Was he holding anything?" "No, sir. But there was a blotter nearby, and someone had tried to remove a sheet from it. Torn hastily, as if in fright, we found a corner of paper tucked behind the mantelpiece." Holmes' eyes narrowed. "And what did it say?" Dunsworthy looked stricken. "Only one word, sir, written in haste. Ticked. Not tickled, as the newspapers have mistakenly reported, but ticked." Holmes gave a rare smile of genuine interest. "A false chime, a man dead of fright, an incomplete message. You intrigue me, Mr. Dunsworthy. We shall leave for Pendlebury House on the morning train." He turned to me. "Watson, pack for cold moors and colder motives. I suspect the clock is only the beginning." The journey to Yorkshire was cloaked in mist and silence. Holmes sat motionless for much of the trip, his chin resting on his steepled fingers, the rhythmic rattle of the carriage wheels seemingly fueling the silent machinery of his mind. I, for my part, studied our client with increasing interest. Charles Dunsworthy had regained a portion of his composure since the previous night, though his hands betrayed him by twitching now and again over the rim of his gloves. His eyes, sharp beneath pale brows, flicked often toward Holmes as though he sought reassurance but feared to ask for it. Pendlebury House loomed over the heath like a relic from a forgotten century. It was a Jacobean monstrosity of mullioned windows and stone that dripped with age, wrapped now in a curtain of drizzle and distant crows. The drive, rutted and overgrown, was lined with leafless trees that clawed at the mist. As we stepped from the cab, Holmes inhaled the air deeply. "Note the silence," he murmured to me. "Even the birds prefer to keep their counsel." Dunsworthy led us inside, where the cavernous front hall greeted us with an oppressive hush. High above, portraits of grim-lipped ancestors stared down from blackened frames. An elderly maid took our coats with the hesitance of someone unused to strangers, and we were shown at once to the west drawing-room. Holmes paused on the threshold. I could see his keen eyes sweep the chamber, noting the soot streak across the mantel, the indentations on the carpet, the subtle scuff marks at the legs of a chair. The grandfather clock stood solemnly in the corner, its pendulum motionless. A scent of lavender hung faintly in the air, overlaid with something else, something more acrid. "It has not been touched since the night Lord Percival died," said Dunsworthy quietly. Holmes stepped inside and went first to the fireplace. A marble mantel, modestly adorned, stood over a grate now filled with cold ash. He knelt, examining the area behind it, and after a moment drew from the narrow crevice a torn corner of paper. "The other servants said it was burned," Dunsworthy offered, "but Miss Lucilla, the Marquess's niece, retrieved this before it could be consumed." Holmes held the scrap up to the light. One corner bore the lower loop of a capital T and a short slash, clearly the fragment of the word ticked Dunsworthy had described. The tear was sharp, but not ragged. "No sign of resistance?" Holmes asked. "None. He was seated there." Dunsworthy pointed to a high-backed armchair, alone after dinner. When the clock chimed, several of us heard it. "He didn't answer when called. We found him dead 5 minutes later." Holmes walked slowly to the grandfather clock. It was a handsome relic in dark oak, its face slightly tarnished, and the brass pendulum visible through a glass pane. He examined its mechanism with quiet concentration, then stepped back. "Watson," he said without turning, "what do you make of this?" I joined him. At first glance, the clock seemed unremarkable, an ordinary long-case timepiece, though clearly in need of maintenance. "I can only say," I replied, "that if it truly struck 13 at midnight, there must be a mechanical fault. But the implication, if we accept that Lord Percival died of fright at the sound, is absurd." "Not absurd," Holmes said coolly. "Highly specific and designed." He turned suddenly to Dunsworthy. "Who knew Lord Percival would be in this room at that hour?" Dunsworthy appeared taken aback. "Well, only the household. It was his custom, particularly since his illness. He disliked retiring early and often sat here to read." "Who benefits from his death?" The steward hesitated. "He was unmarried and without issue. The estate passes to his younger brother, the current Marquess, but—" "Who is already in possession of the title," Holmes interrupted. "So the estate returns to the family core. Not an immediate motive, perhaps. Any recent quarrels? Financial trouble?" "None that I'm aware of." Holmes was silent for a long moment, then turned away and knelt by the fireplace once more. He examined the hearth, the grate, and the carpet in front of it, then stood and crossed to the writing desk near the window. The blotter sat open. Holmes turned it over carefully, running his fingers over the pressed paper. He opened a small drawer and found a stick of sealing wax, a broken pen, and a few sheets of unused stationery. Nothing else. There was no ink bottle, he observed. Only a pen, snapped clean through. That is correct, said Dunsworthy. I thought it strange too, but the Marquis said it might have broken in the fall. Holmes frowned. And the ink? Missing. We searched the entire room, not a trace of a bottle. Holmes straightened. A man writing a message in haste would not remove the ink unless he intended to prevent something being read. But the message was barely started, I interjected a bit, which is precisely the point. Holmes gave me a keen glance. He began to write, was interrupted, and his assailant, whether known or unknown, destroyed the note, but not entirely. That word ticked. It is deliberate. It is not merely about the clock. No, Watson, it is a signal. A light knock at the door preceded the entrance of a woman in her 20s, dressed plainly, but with a natural elegance. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but her bearing was steady. Mr. Holmes, I am Lucilla Hartingford. I understand you wish to speak with me. Holmes bowed slightly. Indeed, Miss Hartingford. It was you who recovered the paper fragment? Yes. I found it the next morning. I feared it might be important. And you showed it to the Marquis? She hesitated. I did not. I was afraid he might dismiss it. He believes Uncle Percival died of natural causes, and he does not wish the matter probed. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Interesting. Yet he allowed Mr. Dunsworthy to seek outside help. Lucilla looked at the steward. Only after I insisted. Charles has served our family for years. He knew something wasn't right. Holmes gave a small nod. Tell me, Miss Hartingford, did you hear the clock strike? I did. I was in the gallery. It struck 12. Then one more time, like a hiccup. It startled me. Was Lord Percival known to be afraid of clocks? No, she said, confused. Then consider what might have caused him to interpret a 13th chime as a signal of death. She faltered, then said, he was very superstitious about numbers. He used to say that anything after 12 was borrowed time. I always thought it a harmless quirk. Holmes turned away and looked once more at the inert clock. His eyes had gone distant again, but I knew the look. He was constructing something in his mind, something elaborate and deeply precise. As we took our leave of the room, he stopped abruptly in the corridor and addressed Dunsworthy. Have the mechanisms of that clock examined. I believe it has been tampered with to produce an extra chime. Do not speak of this to anyone save myself, and arrange for me to speak with the Marquess at once. You believe Lord Percival was murdered then? Dunsworthy asked. Holmes paused. Let us say this. Clocks do not strike by accident, paper does not vanish on its own, and a man does not die of fright without a cause. No, Mr. Dunsworthy, there is more at play here, and someone in Pendlebury House wants the hour of midnight to carry a message, not merely for the dead, but for the living. We followed him into the gloom of the east wing, the chill in the hall seeming to deepen with every step. We were shown to a smaller parlour off the eastern corridor, wood-panelled and close with the scent of beeswax and tobacco. The Marquess of Hartingford awaited us there, his bearing unmistakably that of the old nobility. Tall, angular, and impeccably groomed, yet with a tightness around the eyes that suggested strain or calculation. He did not rise as we entered, but inclined his head with restrained civility. Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I understand my steward has brought you here regarding my brother's unfortunate passing. Holmes's tone was light, almost disinterested. Your brother's death is indeed curious, my lord. I would hardly call it unfortunate when a man dies without injury or apparent malady, unless, of course, the cause is unnatural. Hartingford's expression did not change. He was ailing for some time, A weak constitution, made worse by brooding habits, he would not listen to reason, refused both town and physicians. Yet he made use of his hands, wrote letters daily, and took a solitary chair each night. Out of stubbornness, not health. Holmes sat across from him, lacing his fingers. "Permit me a direct question, Lord Hartingford. Did you hear the grandfather clock chime 13? The Marquis leaned back. "I was asleep. I do not keep such count of superstitions. But you were informed." "Yes." The servants chatter, but I see no connection between an old clock's eccentricity and my brother's demise. I'm told the local coroner agrees heart failure, a peaceful death. Holmes regarded him with narrowed eyes. "Then I must ask why. In the days following, the clock was not examined. Why a blotting pad was left in place, a broken pen not discarded, a paper half burned but not mentioned. There has been no effort to tidy the scene, only to seal it." "My niece insisted," said Hartingford smoothly. "Lucilla was very close to Percival. She finds comfort in preservation, I believe." "And you, my lord? Did you not think it strange he would tear a message mid-word and perish before completing it?" Hartingford's mouth thinned. "I think grief can make phantoms of trifles." Holmes smiled. "As can guilt." There was a long pause. I expected a protest, or perhaps outrage. But instead the Marquis stood and walked to the hearth, where he busied himself lighting a long match. "I shall not have my household disrupted by baseless insinuations. If you uncover a murderer, Mr. Holmes, you may name him, but until then I suggest you do not toy with my patience." "On the contrary, my lord," Holmes said, rising, "it is your clock that has toyed with time, and your brother who has paid for it." We returned to the corridor, Holmes silent until we reached the base of the stair. "He's lying, Watson," he said softly. "Not about the clock, but about the night. He was awake. He heard it." "How can you be certain?" "Because his boots were polished anew, but the soles bear dry clay from the garden path, the west side. That soil does not reach this wing, and certainly not the bedroom hall. He went to the drawing-room that night, or at least past it." Before I could reply, a faint rustle behind us made us turn. A woman, mid-30s, dark-haired, with a reserved elegance, emerged from a side corridor. She inclined her head with a curious mix of respect and wariness. "You are Mr. Holmes," she said. "I am Mrs. Cressida Vale. I was companion to Lord Percival." Holmes greeted her with a slight nod. "The name was not mentioned." "No," she said calmly. "The Marquess does not like reminders that Percival was not entirely alone in this house." Holmes motioned toward a nearby chair, and she sat, folding her gloved hands in her lap. "I attended Lord Percival in his final weeks," she continued. "Not medically. He required no nurse, only company. I read to him, helped him manage correspondence, kept him from dwelling too long on matters of the past." Was he fearful? Number, but cautious. He distrusted his brother. And he believed someone had entered the drawing-room without his knowledge more than once. Why did he think so? "Because items would shift," she said. "His books, his papers, and once, a small thing, the ash in the hearth was warm before he lit the fire. He did not speak of it often, but it disturbed him." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Did he ever say whom he suspected?" Number, he was not certain, but he did begin hiding notes in odd places, half-finished phrases under the rug, words written on the back of paintings. I thought it eccentric, but after he died, I began to wonder. "Have you recovered any of them?" Mrs. Vale hesitated, then reached into her satchel and withdrew a small, folded scrap. This was wedged behind the baseboard of his cabinet. Holmes took it gently. The handwriting was uneven, hurried. It read, "Time is wrong. Shadow at the door, sound with no source." He turned the paper over. In smaller letters, almost faint, Midnight is not midnight. Holmes rose abruptly. Watson, we must examine that clock again, this time with tools. We returned to the west drawing room. The gloom had thickened, and Holmes instructed the steward to bring a lamp. As the warm light filled the chamber, he knelt before the clock once more and produced a small knife from his pocket. "Help me, Watson." Between us we eased the front panel open, exposing the gears and bells within. Holmes studied them silently, then removed the faceplate with meticulous care. There, jammed behind the bell hammer, was a narrow spring, rigged with a fine wire. "Someone added this," Holmes murmured. "It causes the hammer to delay a second strike precisely timed, a 13th chime, ingenious, and unmistakably deliberate." He reached further inside and retrieved a tiny parcel of cloth, long concealed between the inner wall and the pendulum shaft. He unwrapped it, slowly. Inside lay a brass key, a small bottle of ink, and a folded slip of paper. He read the note aloud. "To find the one who watches time, you must watch them when they believe time stands still." Holmes sat back, face thoughtful. He suspected he was being observed. This is not a puzzle, it is a trail, a breadcrumb left by a man aware that death approached and that his words were all he had left. "Who would know to tamper with a clock, Holmes?" I asked. "Who would possess both access and skill?" "That," he said slowly, "is precisely what we must determine. The Marquess could hire a man. Miss Hartingford lacks the knowledge. Mrs. Vale, perhaps." He pocketed the contents. "We are no longer dealing with a single act of violence, Watson. This is architecture, a design built over weeks, perhaps months. The question is not only who killed Lord Percival, but who orchestrated the illusion around him. An illusion built of sound, time, and fear? Exactly, and like any illusion, it must have a purpose. That night, the wind moaned across the Yorkshire moors, and the house itself seemed to lean into the darkness. In the firelit quiet of our guest chamber, Holmes sat again in his chair, pipe idle in his fingers, eyes fixed upon the clock's spectral face. Midnight approached, and with it I could not help but wonder, what if it chimed again? And what might be waiting on the other side of that impossible 13th note? The wind battered the windows of Pendlebury House with a slow insistence, like fingers drumming in impatience, as if the moor itself were eager for the truth to surface. The hour crept toward midnight, and Holmes, ever the embodiment of restless precision, stood once more before the grandfather clock in the drawing-room. I had half expected him to remain seated and contemplative, but instead he had taken up a small notebook and had begun drawing diagrams, gear ratios, strike intervals, pendulum oscillations. His brow was furrowed in that peculiar expression I knew well, a mind pressing forward into the thicket of deception. "Watson," he said without looking up, "we must consider not only the clock but what it represents. A signal, yes, but for whom? For the murderer?" I asked, "not for the first time that day?" "Or," Holmes replied, "from the victim himself." I turned to the hearth where the remnants of the previous fire had cooled to soft grey. The silence of the room was almost complete, save the faint ticking of the clock. I could not help but glance at it, half expecting it to chime again, as if defying logic would become its new role in this dark farce. "I believe," Holmes said, tapping his finger against the edge of the paper he held, "that Lord Percival knew he had been marked. The clock was not a mere curiosity, it was a message, but not to us, to someone within this house." "Then he suspected someone close to him?" I said. "Exactly. The rigging of the clock, the extra chime, was designed not simply to startle, but to trigger recognition. He meant to unnerve someone into reaction. The question is who? As if on cue, the door creaked, and Lucilla Hartingford entered, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders. "Forgive me," she said softly. "I could not sleep. I heard voices." Holmes gestured to a chair. "Not at all. In fact, Miss Hartingford, your insight may be valuable." She sat, her expression cautious. "I've told you what I can, but you haven't told me who has a key to this room." She blinked. "A key?" "Yes. The drawing room is usually locked, is it not?" She hesitated. "Yes, since the silver incident last spring. There are only 3 keys. My uncle had one, the steward another, and the third—" "The Marquis. Not yourself? Number though I could borrow my uncle's if necessary." Holmes leaned forward. "And had you?" She looked suddenly uncomfortable. "Once. A month ago. I came here to fetch a book for him. He'd forgotten it and was already in bed." "A simple errand," Holmes murmured. "And Mrs. Vale?" "I don't know. She came and went as he required. He trusted her." Holmes stood, crossed to the fireplace and took the poker in hand, stirring the ashes lightly. "You said you heard the chime, Miss Hartingford? It struck 12, and then one more?" "Yes, just after the house had gone quiet. I remember because I had just finished reading, and was blowing out my lamp." "You heard it clearly?" "Yes. It echoed down the corridor. I thought it odd." Holmes replaced the poker and turned to face her. "And what happened the next morning?" "We were told he had passed. The Marquis made arrangements immediately. The local physician wrote a certificate, and it was declared natural causes." "But you did not believe that?" Her face tightened. "I felt it in my bones. It was too abrupt. He had been speaking of the future. He had even asked me to post a letter the following day." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "A letter?" "Yes." "But I never found it." "And he had written it the night before?" "He had said so." Holmes turned to me. "Another message, Watson. One that never left the house." Lucilla stood. "Mr. Holmes, if you believe he was murdered, then who do you suspect?" "I suspect," Holmes said slowly, "that your uncle was attempting to name someone who understood the message ticked, someone who would hear that clock and interpret it not as a malfunction, but as an accusation." "But who would that be?" "That," he replied, "is what I must uncover before another message is lost." Lucilla left shortly thereafter, and Holmes resumed his position at the desk, where he pored once more over the items retrieved from the clock. The ink bottle, the key, the folded note. His brow darkened. "I believe we must speak to Mrs. Vale again," he said. "Alone?" "There is something about her demeanour, controlled, yet not guarded in the way the Marquis is. She is concealing something, but not in the same manner." We found her in her quarters, seated by the window with a book unopened on her lap. She rose immediately at our knock. "Of course, Mr. Holmes," she said with a faint smile. "You have questions." "I always have questions, madam. The answers tend to reveal themselves with time." She gestured to a pair of chairs. "Please." Holmes remained standing. "I must ask, did you ever receive a letter from Lord Percival, or see him write one on the night of his death?" She glanced toward her writing table, where a small arrangement of dried lavender lay. "Number?" "He dictated none to me, if that's what you mean. He had taken to writing in solitude, I believe, to conceal the content." "He trusted you?" "I believe so, but he was increasingly paranoid. He suspected the house watched him." Holmes raised an eyebrow. "Did he say so?" "In his way, obliquely. He once told me, 'The clocks are not the only things being wound around here.' I thought it nonsense at the time." "Do you know if he used any kind of cipher?" She paused. "I wouldn't be surprised. He loved puzzles. As a young man, he used to communicate with his sister entirely through acrostics. Holmes's expression grew distant. Acrostics? He turned to me. Watson, the note in the clock, the words he used, to find the one who watches time, you must watch them when they believe time stands still. The phrase, watches time, it may be literal. A person with a pocket watch, or one who works by a schedule, Holmes mused, or someone always present when the clocks are silent. He turned back to Mrs. Vale. Where were you when the chime struck? She frowned. In my room. I had already retired. Could anyone vouch for that? She lifted her chin. Nor should they need to. Holmes didn't answer. Instead, he offered a short bow and departed without further explanation. Back in our chamber, he took up his notebook again, scribbling a series of letters vertically along the page. Ticked, time, midnight. Then he wrote beside them, matching letters, forming strange chains. It's a code, he said finally. Not a message to us, but a trap. He used his fear as bait. He suspected someone would remove a message, but not the trace of the message itself. We need to find more of these scraps. If even one remains in its place, it may unlock the rest. And what if we find none? Then we wait for midnight, because the next clue may not be written in ink. And as the clock ticked on, I could not help but feel, as Holmes had suspected, that something in the house was waiting for us, hidden behind ordinary time, coiled in the silence between seconds. The hands of the clock reached 10 minutes to midnight. Holmes stood by the window, the darkness of the moor pressing against the glass like a sea of secrets. In his hand he held the note retrieved from the clock, the cryptic riddle left by Lord Percival, as though willing it to divulge more under the pressure of approaching time. You see, Watson, he said quietly, we're circling ever closer. The murderer believed the riddle died with its author, but Percival left a fuse smouldering in the walls of this house. I nodded, watching as he turned again to the sheet of notations on the desk, lines of acrostics and phrases, letters paired and crossed out in that chaotic order Holmes alone could command into meaning. There is a pattern to it all, he muttered. Something that connects his obsession with time, the extra chime, and the sense of being watched. It's not just paranoia. He suspected someone was always nearby, always listening, and chose the clock as his form of retaliation. Before I could respond, there was a knock at the door, sharp and brief. Holmes opened it to find Dunsworthy standing in the corridor, eyes shadowed with fatigue. I hope I'm not disturbing you, the steward said, but something's come to light, quite literally. He held out a folded square of fabric, an old linen handkerchief, and within it, wrapped delicately in the folds, was a narrow shard of glass, no longer than a matchstick. I found it when closing the shutters in the morning room, Dunsworthy explained. It was on the carpet, near the base of the grandfather clock in that room. It's not been used in years. But the shape caught the light, and I remembered your interest in the clock mechanisms. Holmes took it reverently, holding it to the lamp. The edge was fine, one side slightly blackened. Burnt, Holmes said softly. But not by accident. It's a lens, cracked under heat. I leaned closer. From a lamp? Possibly. Or a projection device. Someone had cause to conceal it, and to use it near another clock. But why? Shall I wake the housekeeper? Dunsworthy asked. There may be other pieces. No, Holmes said sharply. This must remain between us for now. You've done precisely the right thing. Dunsworthy gave a short nod and turned to go, but paused. If I may, Mr. Holmes, do you truly believe Lord Percival left us some kind of message? Holmes met his gaze. I do, and I believe that message was meant to expose someone close, The clock chimed 13 to say, "Look again, you've missed something." The steward left us, and Holmes resumed pacing. I watched him with growing unease. Never had I seen him so immersed in a mystery, woven not just with logic, but emotion, layered like a game of chess with ghostly hands moving pieces only Holmes could perceive. At last he stopped and faced me. "Come, Watson, we must go back to the morning room." "But it's near midnight." "Exactly." We moved through the slumbering halls in silence, our footfalls softened by the carpet. The house was heavy with that peculiar stillness which belongs only to ancient dwellings, where every sound carries weight and each creak of wood echoes with imagined purpose. The morning room had an eastward view, now swallowed by darkness. Holmes closed the door behind us and lit the wall lamp with deliberate care, its glow casting long shadows across the furniture. "Observe," he said, moving to the clock at the far wall. It was nearly identical to the one in the drawing-room, though dusty and unpolished. Holmes opened the lower panel and examined the weights and chains. "Untouched for years," he murmured, "but not forgotten." He then stepped back and looked around the room, eyes scanning each corner. "There," he said, pointing to a spot near the hearth. He crouched and examined a faint discoloration on the skirting board, a square mark as though something had once been mounted and since removed. A bracket, perhaps? Holmes drew a line around it with his finger. "The size and soot pattern suggest a lantern apparatus once stood here, low to the floor, aimed toward the clock." I followed his gaze. The positioning would cause the light to strike the pendulum chamber. "A projection?" I asked. "More than that," Holmes said. "A visual cue. Suppose Lord Percival suspected someone was entering this room in secret. He prepares a trap, not with confrontation, but illusion. He uses this lens to cast something onto the face of the clock, a number perhaps, a symbol, and the lens shattered? Likely when it overheated or fell. Either way, the mechanism failed, or was deliberately sabotaged." There was a sudden creak behind us. Holmes turned at once, finger to his lips. We both listened. Footsteps, soft, deliberate. Holmes extinguished the lamp, and we stood in shadow. The footsteps paused outside the door. A long silence followed. Then the handle turned, very slowly, and the door began to open. The figure that stepped inside was tall, cloaked in a dark robe or dressing gown, and held no lamp. They moved confidently as though well acquainted with the room's geography. The figure approached the clock, knelt, and reached for the pendulum case. Holmes waited only a moment longer before striking a match. The flare of light froze the intruder, who recoiled and raised an arm. It was Mrs. Vale. She straightened, her face expressionless, though her eyes flashed. "I didn't expect company," she said coolly. "Few burglars do," Holmes replied. "But then you weren't here to steal, were you?" She said nothing. Holmes gestured toward the clock. "What were you looking for? The lens you lost? Or perhaps the rest of Percival's message?" She lifted her chin. "I was looking for the truth." Holmes stepped closer. "And hoping, perhaps, to destroy what remained of it before anyone else found it?" "I don't appreciate the accusation." "No," Holmes said quietly. "But you were the only one who could have manipulated both clocks, the only one with the mechanical precision and motive." "Motive?" She laughed, a sharp sound. "Do you think I killed him for money?" "I think you loved him," Holmes said, voice soft, "and that you hated the one he truly trusted, Lucilla." Mrs. Vale's breath caught. "You believed he was going to leave everything to her. You knew where he kept his final testament. You intercepted the letter meant to name her as heir. And you used the clock as misdirection, to create a haunting that would mask the very human shape of betrayal. "No," she whispered. "No, it wasn't like that. He promised me—" "But changed his mind," Holmes said gently. "And you knew it." She stood in silence, the faint light catching the tears at the corner of her eyes. Holmes said nothing further. He stepped past her and opened the back of the clock. There, tucked into the hollow behind the pendulum shaft, was a second note, creased and yellowed. He unfolded it. "To whomever finds this. I am not afraid, but I do not trust those who smile too sweetly. The hour will tell the truth if it strikes more than it should." Holmes folded the note and pocketed it. Mrs. Vale had sunk into the armchair, hands limp in her lap. "I only wanted him to choose me," she said. "That's all." "But he didn't," Holmes replied. "And so you chose silence." We left her there in the morning room, seated beneath the silent face of the old clock. And though it struck midnight a moment later, it gave only 12 chimes, clean, precise, and final. We emerged from the morning room into the dark hush of the hallway, the air thick with the weight of what had just transpired. Holmes walked ahead of me in silence, the faint light of his lamp casting our long shadows against the walls, as though we were being followed by the truth we had yet to fully uncover. Despite Mrs. Vale's stunned confession, if one could call it that, there remained a gnawing unease in Holmes's bearing, a tautness that told me something did not yet sit right with him. We reached the staircase and began to ascend toward our quarters. Holmes halted halfway up and turned toward the west wing, his eyes narrowing as he gazed into the gloom beyond. "She was lying," he said abruptly. "About what?" I asked, surprised. "She admitted her jealousy. She was clearly involved in tampering with the evidence." "Yes, but she did not kill him." I stopped. "Holmes, surely—" "She entered the morning room tonight not to remove the final clue, but to see if he had left something for her, something he had promised. Her words were too bitter to be born of guilt alone. She believed she had been wronged after his death, not before." "Then who?" "Someone else planted the lens, someone else constructed the 13th chime. Mrs. Vale's crime was in concealing what she found and perhaps hiding the will, but she was not the hand that struck Percival down." We resumed walking, and Holmes's voice grew more urgent as we entered our room, and he closed the door behind us. "We've been led into a cul-de-sac, Watson. A crime of emotion was laid like a veil over a crime of calculation. Someone wanted us to focus on Mrs. Vale. They relied on her secrecy to mask their own design." He seated himself and drew the second note, the one retrieved from the clock, onto the table, smoothing it flat. His eyes traced the inked lines with the precision of a cartographer mapping a hidden country. "I've been asking the wrong question," he said, almost to himself. "Not who tampered with the clock, but who knew it would chime when it did, and who would benefit from the fear it produced." "You believe the chime wasn't just meant for Lord Percival?" "Number it was for an audience. Someone waited for it to sound, and used that moment to act." There was a knock at the door. This time it was Lucilla, wrapped in a heavy dressing gown, her eyes wide but steady. "I saw light," she said, her voice low. "Is it true about Mrs. Vale?" Holmes gestured her inside. "She entered the morning room tonight, yes, and she confirmed suspicions about her personal ambitions. But tell me, Miss Hartingford, do you recall when you last saw your uncle's personal seal?" "My uncle's seal?" She frowned. "The signet he used for private correspondence. It was kept in his desk, I believe." "In the writing desk in the drawing room?" "Yes, in a small wooden box beneath the stationery drawer." Holmes rose instantly and motioned to me. "Come, Watson." We made our way again through the now familiar passages to the west drawing room. Holmes moved directly to the writing desk, opened the drawer, and began probing its interior with his long fingers. At last, he slid out a false bottom with a muted click. Beneath it lay a wooden box, empty, save for the imprint left by the missing signet. "He used this to seal the letter Lucilla never found," Holmes said. But the seal was taken. That letter, if indeed it named a new heir, was not simply destroyed, it was rewritten. I stepped back, stunned. "Are you suggesting a forgery?" "Not a suggestion, Watson, a certainty." We returned to the hallway and Holmes turned to Lucilla. "You told me your uncle asked you to post a letter the following day, yet you never found it. What did you expect that letter to be?" She hesitated. "He said it concerned the estate. He had made a final decision. He didn't say what, but I thought it might be about me. He always said I was like a daughter to him." Holmes nodded. "And you shared that expectation with anyone?" "Only Charles," she said. "He's known me since I was a child. I confided in him when the letter went missing." Holmes's eyes sharpened. "You did." Lucilla blinked, then her brow furrowed. "Why?" We returned to our quarters once more. Holmes threw himself into the armchair, fingers steepled again, the very image of concentrated tension. "Watson, everything converges now," he said. "We have been circling the edges of the true motive, but now we must ask, who gains if Lucilla is removed from inheritance?" "The Marquis," I said at once. "Yes, but he was already heir by law." "He never expected Percival to revise the will. Yet once he suspected as much, he would surely act." "Then it was him all along," I said. "No," Holmes replied coldly. "He is arrogant, but not clever. The forgery requires subtlety, the mechanism, mechanical skill, the deceit, intimate knowledge of the household's inner workings." I stared at him. "You can't mean—" "Yes, Watson. The man who has stood beside us since the beginning, the one person with access to all rooms, all correspondence, all clocks." "Dunsworthy?" Holmes rose. He knew about the seal. He knew Lucilla expected a letter. He had the motive, to ensure the will remained unchanged. If Lord Percival named Lucilla as his heir, Dunsworthy's own position in the household, guaranteed under the Marquis, less so under Lucilla, would be endangered. "And the clock?" I asked. He could access both clocks without suspicion. He set the trap, counting on Mrs. Vale to discover it, and to draw our suspicion with her guilt and silence. He used her like a smokescreen, the lens, the ink, the forged note, all part of a misdirection. But Percival died of fright. "No," Holmes said, his voice low. "He was poisoned." He crossed to his valise and retrieved the ink bottle recovered from the clock. Holding it up, he said, "Lord Percival wrote his final note in a hurry. He used the ink at hand, but it had been replaced. I smelled something sharp. Bitter almonds." "Cyanide?" Holmes nodded. "Enough to be absorbed through a cut or skin contact. Remember the blot on his thumb? He had just written ticked. The poison was on the ink or the pen nib. He died moments later, never finishing the word." "And Dunsworthy knew he would use it?" "He either planted the ink himself or manipulated the environment so that Percival would reach for it." I was silent for a long moment, the weight of it all settling like fog. "We must confront him." "Not yet," Holmes said. "We must first ensure that the forged will exists, and secure the original if it still survives." "Where would he hide it?" Holmes's lips pressed into a tight line. "Somewhere close, somewhere he alone would believe beyond suspicion." The corridor clock chimed once, midnight. Holmes moved to the window and stared into the darkness. "Watson, fetch Lestrade. We are nearly at the end, but the final chime must strike in the presence of justice." And so I went, the house quiet behind me, but no longer still. In its hush, secrets waited like coiled serpents, ready to hiss into the light. It was nearly 1 o'clock by the time I returned to Pendlebury House with Inspector Lestrade in tow, the fog having grown thicker and the air sharper with that damp chill particular to the Yorkshire moors. Lestrade, coat buttoned high and expression alert, had listened to my hurried summary on the journey with a furrowed brow and the occasional shake of his head. He was not by temperament a man easily swayed by theory, but he knew Holmes's methods too well to dismiss such claims out of hand. Holmes met us in the entrance hall. He was composed, standing beneath the oil portrait of the late Lord Hartingford's father, his features unreadable in the shifting lamplight. "Lestrade," he greeted quietly. "You're just in time. The curtain is about to rise." "I've heard the overture, Holmes," Lestrade said, removing his gloves, "and it's a damned strange tune. You're telling me the steward killed his master using poisoned ink and a manipulated clock? That's the essence of it, but you'll have the pleasure of seeing the rest for yourself. Watson, take us to Dunsworthy's quarters, if you would." We moved swiftly along the back hall, our footsteps muffled by the thick runner carpeting. I had rarely seen Holmes walk with such coiled tension, every step marked with deliberation, every turn of his head calculating shadows and spaces. We stopped before a plain oak door near the servants' wing. Holmes knocked briskly. There was no answer. He knocked again. After a pause, footsteps approached, and the door opened. Dunsworthy appeared in shirt-sleeves and slippers, his hair slightly dishevelled, though his face remained calm. "Mr. Holmes," he said, puzzled. "Is something wrong?" Holmes smiled faintly. "Indeed, something is quite wrong. May we come in?" Dunsworthy hesitated for the barest second, then stepped aside. "Of course." Lestrade and I followed Holmes into the modest chamber. A fire smouldered low in the grate, and a book lay open on the writing-table beside a glass of brandy. Everything was in perfect order. Too perfect. Holmes made a slow circuit of the room before speaking. "You've served the Hartingfords for how long, Mr. Dunsworthy?" 27 years. "And yet, despite such loyalty, you found yourself facing an uncertain future, especially if Lord Percival altered his will." Dunsworthy said nothing. Holmes nodded toward the brandy glass. "May I?" Dunsworthy inclined his head. Holmes lifted the glass but did not drink. Instead, he studied the rim, then placed it aside. The last of Lord Percival's letters disappeared. You knew Lucilla expected it. You knew Mrs. Vale would remain silent out of fear and pride. You used them both, one as misdirection, the other as a red herring. Dunsworthy's voice was low. "You're making dangerous accusations, sir." "Not accusations," Holmes said, stepping closer. "Proof. You manipulated the grandfather clock to chime 13, not just to frighten Lord Percival, but to create a spectacle. You tainted the ink he used to write his final message, knowing he would reach for it. And when he collapsed, believing he had heard his own doom, you made certain the truth vanished with him." Still Dunsworthy said nothing, but his hand twitched toward the desk drawer. Lestrade moved swiftly. "Don't!" Dunsworthy froze. Holmes reached the desk first and pulled open the drawer. Inside was a sealed envelope resting atop a folded sheet of paper. Holmes took them both and opened the envelope first. The wax bore the Hartingford family crest, carefully pressed, but with a faint indentation inconsistent with Lord Percival's usual signet. Holmes examined it, then the letter within. His eyes scanned it quickly, and a faint smile tugged at his mouth. "A forgery," he said, holding it out to Lestrade. "The language is wrong, the phrasing unlike Percival's hand. And this," he tapped the seal, "was pressed not with the signet but with a wax impression." Dunsworthy's face remained rigid. "You can't prove that I made it." Holmes held up the second document, A page written in Percival's hand, dated 2 days before his death. The ink was slightly faded, the page creased, as if long folded. "I believe I can. This," Mr. Dunsworthy was hidden behind the panel in the grandfather clock. "It is Lord Percival's true testament, unwitnessed, but with his full signature and hand. He left it as a backup, I suspect, fearing the first might never reach its destination." Lestrade stepped forward and read it, his brow lifted. "It names Lucilla as primary heir," he said. "And this is the same hand we've seen in other documents." "Indeed," Holmes said. "Compare the signature to the one on your forgery. The flourish is wrong, the pressure inconsistent." Dunsworthy's jaw tightened. "You're forgetting something. I could have found that letter and planted it myself. Who's to say I didn't forge that?" "You," Holmes said coolly. "Number. You wouldn't have left it in the clock. You would have burned it, along with every other incriminating trace. But you couldn't find it, could you? You searched the desk, the fireplace, the drawers, but not the clock." He turned to Lestrade. "Inspector, if you examine the ink bottle found in the drawing room, I believe you'll detect traces of prussic acid. Lord Percival died too suddenly, with no preceding symptoms and no known condition. His thumb bore ink. His final word was incomplete." "I'll have it tested," Lestrade said. "You'll also find," Holmes added, "the missing signet impression tool in this room, likely in the cupboard near the hearth." Dunsworthy took a step back, and in that moment I saw the collapse begin, not physical but emotional. His shoulders sagged, his mouth twitched once, and then stilled. "I gave everything to this family," he said softly. "Years of service. And what did I receive? Dismissal. No title, no acknowledgement. And then the old man choosing a girl he barely knew over a man who carried his affairs for decades." "You had a choice," Holmes said. "You always had one. Not any more." Lestrade stepped forward with his handcuffs. "Charles Dunsworthy, I am placing you under arrest for the suspected murder of Lord Percival Hartingford. You will come with me quietly." Dunsworthy offered no resistance. He said nothing as he was led out of the room, footsteps fading down the hallway. We stood in silence. "Holmes," I said at last, "how did you know the forged letter was here?" "I didn't, not until I saw the brandy," he replied. "A man expecting discovery would destroy such evidence, but Dunsworthy was arrogant. He thought the narrative of Mrs. Vale would hold, and pride, Watson, is often the companion of precision. He needed the forgery close so he could act swiftly, should anything be challenged." "You said the final chime must strike in the presence of justice." "And it has." As we stepped out into the corridor, dawn was just beginning to press at the edge of the windows. The fog still clung to the ground, but the sky beyond hinted at light. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang its first tentative note. Holmes paused by the grandfather clock one final time. He glanced at its brass face, its hands now resting at the beginning of a new hour. "Time," he murmured, "is often an accomplice. But occasionally, just occasionally, it confesses." He turned away, coat trailing behind him like a closing curtain, and I followed. By the time the grey Yorkshire morning had fully bled into the corridors of Pendlebury House, the stillness had begun to shift. The hush of old carpets and drawn curtains was no longer the silence of secrets, but of aftermath. The truth, having slipped so long in shadow, now lay bare. Yet there remained, if only faintly, a sense that not all had been fully understood, not even by those closest to it. Holmes and I stood once more in the west drawing-room, where the grandfather clock, now disarmed of its false chime, ticked with a calm constancy. The mechanism had been reset, the gears wiped clean of the tampering that had summoned its haunting 13th note. Lestrade had departed not long before, escorting the resigned and silent Dunsworthy into custody, with the forged letter, the ink bottle, and the hidden will as evidence in hand. There was no need for further resistance. Dunsworthy, stripped of deception, had faded into defeat without a word. Lucilla Hartingford entered the room quietly. The lines of fatigue beneath her eyes seemed softened now by a fragile dignity, a weariness not from grief alone, but from the long stretch of doubt and tension that had finally broken. "He confessed to the forgery?" she asked. Holmes nodded. In every essential detail, the arrangement of the clock, the tampering with the ink, the concealment of the signet. He was methodical, but not imaginative. He relied too heavily on others, Mrs. Vale's bitterness, the Marquess's arrogance, your grief. "I trusted him," she said softly, staring at the fireless hearth. "We all did." "Which is why he succeeded," Holmes replied. "Trust, Miss Hartingford, is the most dangerous assumption in a house such as this." She looked to him, hesitant. "And the will? You're certain it's genuine?" "It was written in your uncle's hand, in ink predating the poison bottle, sealed with his proper signet, and concealed in a place only he would have thought to hide something, behind the very clock used to frighten him." "Yes, I am certain." Her voice faltered. "Then I inherit everything?" Holmes studied her for a moment before responding. "It appears so." She sat down slowly, as if absorbing the weight of it. "I thought," she murmured, "that I'd feel vindicated, but now all I feel is hollow." "That is often the result of justice," Holmes said quietly. "It arrives not with triumph, but with silence. The pain does not vanish simply because the cause has been removed." She gave a small nod and rose again. "I'm grateful, Mr. Holmes, truly. I don't yet know what I'll do with any of it, but I'll try to honour what my uncle intended." When she had gone, Holmes remained standing in the centre of the room, hands clasped behind his back. I saw the familiar narrowing of his eyes as he surveyed the space, not out of suspicion now, but in contemplative review, as though mentally rewalking each step of the crime to test its angles under the new light of certainty. "Something still troubles you?" I said. "Not the facts," Holmes replied. "They are aligned now, but the psychology." Dunsworthy's method was tidy, almost too tidy. He masked every act behind another's sin or sorrow, but he made one critical mistake. And what was that? He underestimated Lord Percival's understanding of people. Holmes stepped toward the hearth and knelt again, fingers trailing along the edge of the marble. After a moment he pressed a small panel beneath the mantel. There was a faint click, and a slim wooden strip came loose in his hand. Behind it, tucked within a narrow hollow, was a second note. He handed it to me. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was still Lord Percival's, this time firmer, unhurried. "If you are reading this, then the clock has spoken. Dunsworthy has always been meticulous, but he does not understand trust. He mistakes control for loyalty. Lucilla sees the world clearly. May she not become like me." I looked up. "A final safeguard," Holmes said. He knew Dunsworthy might intercept his letter, might destroy the will, might even succeed in killing him. So he created a second trail, not for the law, but for those who came after. One message for the authorities, and one for the future. I stood in silence, rereading the note. There was no anger in the words, no fear. Only resignation, and a peculiar kind of hope. "It's a rare thing," I said, "for a man to plan so carefully in the face of death." Holmes nodded. "It speaks to his character, and it casts a final shadow on the crime, not merely of greed, but of betrayal." Outside, the fog had begun to lift. We walked out into the garden path beyond the west wing, where the brittle grass crunched underfoot and the trees stood stripped by wind. The moor beyond Pendlebury stretched endless and grey, and yet something about the horizon now felt freer, lighter, as though the land itself had been released from tension. "I must say," Holmes remarked, "of all the cases we've taken, this one struck an unusual note." "How so?" "There was no overt violence, no visible weapon, no confrontation. The crime was composed entirely of pressure, subtle manipulations, deceit, silence. A murder committed not with a dagger, but with time itself." He stopped and turned toward the house, its windows catching the pale light. "And yet," he added, "the chime gave it away. A clock cannot lie for long. It keeps time, and in doing so betrays any hand that tries to twist it." We turned back toward the path. In the stillness, I could hear the faint, steady rhythm of the clock inside the house, ticking once more in perfect order, no longer a messenger of fear, but simply what it was always meant to be, a keeper of truth, unclouded by shadow or scheme. Holmes glanced sideways at me. "You'll write this one up, I hope?" "I think I must," I said, "though no headline will do it justice." He gave a faint smile. "Let the readers decide, just don't forget to mention the clock." "I could hardly leave it out," I said. "It was the voice of the crime." "No," Holmes replied thoughtfully. "It was the conscience of it." We returned indoors as the sun rose over Pendlebury House, each window gradually brightening like an eye opened after a long, haunted night. The day was cold but clear, and for once it felt as though the time ahead would pass without interruption, ticking steadily forward into peace. The following afternoon brought a quietness that felt different than before, no longer thick with apprehension, but laden with reflection. Holmes had remained largely silent since our walk through the moorland garden. He'd returned to the west drawing-room after luncheon and positioned himself once more in the armchair Lord Percival had favoured in his final days, his eyes moving slowly about the room as though replaying scenes only he could see. I, meanwhile, had retreated to the library, where the household's legal records and correspondence had been neatly organised by the late steward. It was a curious experience reading through the old ledgers, seeing Dunsworthy's careful hand, precise, controlled, even elegant, meticulously tracking the affairs of the estate. If not for the knowledge of his treachery, one might have mistaken him for a man of enviable principle. Holmes joined me an hour later, a folded sheaf of old newspaper clippings in hand. "I've found something," he said, without preamble, seating himself beside the fire. "A curiosity." I looked up from the journal I had been leafing through. "From the archives?" From beneath the lining of Lord Percival's travelling case. Mrs. Hudson might call it poking about in another man's luggage, but I call it diligence. He handed me the bundle. The top clipping was an article dated some 10 years prior from a local Yorkshire paper. "Scandal narrowly averted in Hartingford estate sale. Steward resolves crisis." I skimmed the text. Dunsworthy's name appeared twice, noted as having negotiated with creditors during what was described as an urgent but confidential financial dilemma. Another clipping from 3 years later told of a disputed heirship in minor branch of Hartingford family, settled once again with the steward's mediation. "What does this suggest?" I asked. Holmes rested his chin against steepled fingers. That Charles Dunsworthy's hand extended further than his title suggested. He was the quiet architect of continuity here, a man who had built his identity not only around loyalty to the family, but control of its direction. I begin to suspect that his crime was not an aberration, but the natural culmination of a life spent manipulating outcomes from the shadows. You believe this was not his first deceit? Not murder, perhaps, but deception? Absolutely. These are not acts of loyalty, Watson. These are acts of self-preservation. He solved problems that might have undermined his own security, and in doing so the family allowed him increasing access until he was nearly untouchable. I set the articles aside. Then Lucilla was right to be wary from the beginning. She had reason to doubt the surface, Holmes said, but she lacked the means to look beneath it. That is where people like Dunsworthy flourish, in the gap between trust and scrutiny. Just then the door opened, and Lucilla entered, carrying a worn, leather-bound book. "I thought you should see this," she said. "It was in my uncle's room, his personal journal. I've read some of it. He writes about the clocks, the sense that he was being watched, but also thoughts on those around him, including you." Holmes raised an eyebrow and accepted the book. He flipped through the pages, scanning quickly, lips tight. "There," Lucilla said, pointing to a page near the middle. "That entry was made a week before his death." Holmes read aloud. "CV remains unreadable. I fear she hopes for something I cannot give. LH has grown strong, perhaps stronger than I knew. D watches everything, always a step behind the shadow, never the source of it. I wonder whether he suspects that I suspect him. I must begin to write things down, leave traces where they cannot be wholly erased. Time is my only ally now, and I must make it speak." He closed the book and looked to her. "This proves what we suspected. Your uncle was neither blind nor paranoid. He was simply outmatched, until the end." Lucilla's voice was quiet. He knew he was being outmaneuvered, but he never stopped trying to fight it. Holmes offered the smallest of nods. Even cornered, he refused to die silently. The clock was his rebellion. As she left, we were both silent for a time. Then Holmes stood and walked to the far window, staring out over the slope of Pendlebury's grounds. "There is one last task," he said, "one final thread." I looked up. "You've solved the case, Holmes. What remains?" He didn't turn. "The Marquess?" I rose slowly. "You believe he was involved?" "I believe he knows more than he has admitted." We found the Marquess seated in his study, a half-full decanter and glass before him. He looked up as we entered, his expression as guarded as it had been on our first meeting. "Back again, Mr. Holmes. I presume you're here to inform me of the obvious, that Dunsworthy murdered my brother." "I am," Holmes replied calmly, "but not solely." The Marquess blinked. "I beg your pardon." "You see," Holmes continued, "Lord Percival's journal contains an odd entry. D watches everything, always a step behind the shadow, never the source of it. One might assume D referred exclusively to Dunsworthy, but it needn't have." "I'm sure I don't know what you're implying." Holmes stepped forward, voice even. "Your brother suspected someone else had taken notice of Dunsworthy's growing influence. Someone who could have intervened, but didn't." The Marquess scoffed. "You think I aided in my brother's death? Rubbish. Number, I think you turned away. You saw the shift in power. You may even have suspected Dunsworthy was manipulating events in the house, but he was convenient, orderly. He made your life easier, and when your brother began to unravel that control, you let Dunsworthy continue because it benefited you." The silence that followed was not defensive, but heavy. The Marquis poured himself another measure of brandy, then stared into the glass. "I never intended for Percival to die." "But you let the wolves roam," Holmes said quietly, "and a man was devoured." The Marquis looked up, his face pale, not with guilt, but something far closer to discomfort. "Do with that what you like," he muttered. "I intend to do nothing," Holmes said. "It is not a crime to be a coward, only to become one's cowardice." We left him then, slumped in his chair, alone with his thoughts and the weight of his inaction. Back in our chamber, Holmes began packing his satchel. "The law has what it needs," he said. "Justice, of a kind, has spoken. And yet you don't seem satisfied." "I rarely am," he said with a faint smile. "Not with cases where the villain is singular, but the blame is shared." We boarded the early train the next morning. As the engine pulled away from the grey edges of Pendlebury House, Holmes sat quietly beside the window, watching the estate disappear behind the rising mist. I opened my notebook to begin recording the final details of the case, but paused as Holmes spoke at last. "It's a strange thing, Watson, how the ticking of a clock, so steady, so reassuring, can become a harbinger, a signal of fear, but in the end it was also a signal of truth." "And of conscience," he nodded. "Yes, Lord Percival's final act was not to accuse, but to reveal. That, I think, is the finest form of revenge, not retribution, but clarity." Outside, the countryside blurred past. Holmes took out his watch, glanced at the time, and then tucked it away again. This time it had ticked only once. The remainder of our journey back to London passed in contemplative silence. Holmes, ever a creature of intense introspection when a case reached its terminus, said little, his gaze alternating between the landscape streaking past the train window and the pages of Lord Percival's journal, which he had kept tucked in his coat pocket. I, too, was lost in thought, my pen resting idly against my notebook, the final account of the case lying half-finished on the page. There was something about this particular investigation that lingered differently in the air. A sense of quiet melancholy, not born from the violence of the act, but from its proximity to those left in its wake. No dramatic gunfire, no desperate flight, no theatrical confessions shouted across rooms. Only a man's life ended in silence, his last attempt to warn the world smothered beneath layers of propriety and assumed loyalty. Holmes finally closed the journal and set it beside him. "Watson," he said, breaking the long quiet, "have you ever noticed how rare it is for the truth to arrive as a complete picture?" I looked up, intrigued. "You mean in cases?" "In everything," he replied. "People expect resolution to carry the satisfaction of finality, a sense that wrong has been righted and all is restored. But life doesn't conform to such tidy closure. Justice is often layered, incomplete, and when truth does emerge, it does so in fragments, shrouded in the failures of those who might have prevented its need." I nodded slowly. "The Marquis?" "Yes. A man of position, paralyzed by the convenience of order. Had he intervened, challenged Dunsworthy, questioned the patterns, the entire tragedy might have been avoided." But he looked away. "And Mrs. Vale?" "She too failed in her way, but her motive was emotional, not malicious. Her concealment served her heart more than her ambition." He leaned back, fingers tented beneath his chin. "Dunsworthy, however, he operated from necessity. And necessity, Watson, is a dangerous moral compass." I scribbled a note, then asked, "Do you believe Lucilla will be safe now?" "She will inherit a burden, not just an estate. But I believe she is capable. Lord Percival saw it, and that tells me all I need to know." The train began its slow descent toward Paddington Station. London appeared like a phantom from the fog, chimneys rising like battlements, smoke mingling with sky, streets already alive with the thrum of traffic and clatter of hooves. It struck me, not for the first time, how distant our world felt from the one we had just left. Pendlebury House, with its whispering halls and ticking clock, belonged to another age, its dramas hidden beneath layers of tradition and damp stone. We arrived at Baker Street by late afternoon. Mrs. Hudson greeted us with a kind of amused exasperation, her usual method of masking concern, then retreated to fetch tea and the post. Holmes, slipping immediately into the rhythm of our lodgings, resumed his place by the fire with a stack of unopened letters. I unpacked and straightened the sitting room, my thoughts drifting again to Percival's cryptic phrase, "Midnight is not midnight." It was only after tea had been poured and the fire stirred to a healthy glow that Holmes spoke again. "There is one more letter," he said, holding up a cream-coloured envelope. I glanced over. "Another from Pendlebury?" "No," he replied, breaking the seal. "From Scotland Yard, Lestrade." He read silently for a moment, then folded the letter neatly and placed it beside the tea tray. "Well?" I prompted. Holmes turned to me, his expression unreadable. "The ink tested positive for prussic acid, as expected. There is no doubt Dunsworthy was the hand behind the death. However, the Yard has chosen not to pursue charges of conspiracy against the Marquess." I frowned. "Do you agree with that decision?" "Insofar as the law requires direct evidence, yes. In spirit, number, but we do not always get both." There was a pause, then Holmes reached into his coat once more and withdrew a final item, one I hadn't seen him collect, the broken lens once hidden inside the second clock. He held it up to the firelight, letting the crack catch the glow. "A fragile thing," he mused. "Just a sliver of glass and heat, but it changed everything." He set it down beside his violin. "The illusion was crafted to frighten," I said. "Yes," Holmes agreed. And it did. But ironically, it also failed. Lord Percival was not destroyed by fear. He was killed by calculation. And therein lies the real story. The clock on our mantel chimed the hour then, 6 o'clock. A clean, unbroken sound. Holmes looked up at it and smiled faintly. "No 13 strike here." I exhaled, unsure whether I was relieved or saddened by the end of it all. "You'll write the case up, of course?" Holmes asked. "I've already begun," I replied. "But I find myself wondering how best to frame it. It lacks the dramatic conclusion some of our cases possess." Holmes considered this. "Then write it plainly, Watson. Let the mystery lie not in the method, but in the silence around it. It is a tale about trust, time, and the subtle tyranny of those who wear masks of service." I nodded, committing the phrase to memory. "And the title?" Holmes reached for his pipe, packing it slowly. "That's your department." After a pause, I looked toward the window where twilight had begun to gather across the London rooftops. "How about The Clock That Tickled Midnight Twice?" Holmes gave a short, quiet laugh. "Sentimental, but accurate." As he struck a match and lit the bowl, the scent of tobacco filled the room, mingling with the warmth of the fire and the ticking of the untroubled clock above the hearth. Outside, the city moved on, unaware of the tragedy that had unfolded miles away, unaware of the note that never reached its addressee, the clock that sounded a death it did not cause, the loyalty that turned to betrayal in a quiet, ancestral home. And yet, in that sitting room, as Holmes closed his eyes and let the smoke curl into the air, it felt as though some corner of the world had been set right again, not loudly, not finely, but truly. And sometimes I thought, that is all we can ask of justice. The following week passed uneventfully, at least by Holmes's standards. No telegrams summoned us north or west. No clients burst into 221B with trembling hands or trembling voices. Yet I sensed Holmes was not at rest. The Pendlebury matter, though resolved in the eyes of the law, had left some dust unsettled in the corners of his mind. He had spent the past 2 days reviewing Lord Percival's journal once more, poring over passages with the fastidious attention of a man retracing his own footsteps, not for error, but for something overlooked. I knew that look, not obsession, but intellectual disquiet. Holmes would not be satisfied until every element of the crime aligned with his internal order of cause and consequence. Late that evening, as the gaslight flickered and the fire burned low, he set the journal aside and said quietly, "It still wasn't quite right, Watson." I lowered the medical journal I had been reading. "The case?" "The message," he replied. Percival's journal, his scraps. The phrase "midnight is not midnight." It wasn't just metaphor, it was literal. I waited. Holmes rose, crossed to the window, and looked out into the lamplit street. He wasn't just signalling that something was off with time or the clock. He was pointing to a very specific inconsistency, one that no one else recognized, not even Dunsworthy. He turned back to me. "Watson, what did Lucilla say about hearing the clock strike?" I blinked. "That she heard 12? And then one more, 13? Yes, she was upstairs in her chamber at the time, but Dunsworthy claimed he was in bed. Others, too. None heard anything unusual." Holmes's voice dropped. "And yet, the sound travelled far enough to reach Lucilla's room, but not the others." "She may simply have been more alert. Or," Holmes said with quiet satisfaction, "she may have heard it before midnight." I sat upright. "Before?" "She said she'd just finished reading and was preparing to extinguish her lamp. I thought it a minor detail at the time, but consider this. Percival died before the clock chimed 13. That was the illusion. But what if he died during the 12 strokes, and the 13th was only heard later by someone outside the room?" A pause passed between us. Holmes paced. "Percival never heard the 13th chime. He collapsed before it. The poison took effect during the 12th stroke. He was already dying when the signal was triggered. Therefore, the final chime wasn't to frighten him, it was to mark his death for someone else." I stared. "But who?" Holmes stopped. "Lucilla." He let the name hang for a long breath. Then he sat down again and spoke, softer now. I went back through the notes. Percival repeatedly mentions the girl is stronger than I knew. And at one point, she smiles with her mother's eyes. But sharper, she asks questions now. Watson, Lucilla was far more than just the innocent heir. She was a silent player, and not just in grief. I struggled to find words. "But surely you don't believe—" "No," Holmes said, "not that. She did not kill him, but she expected someone would, and she helped him prepare for it. It was too much at once." I tried to steady my thoughts. "Then why not warn anyone?" "Because she needed it to happen," Holmes said. "She believed Dunsworthy would act. She may even have known how. But she trusted that Percival's arrangements would reveal the truth, and in doing so, prevent the inheritance from being twisted again. It was justice." Through silence, he stood once more and placed a folded letter into my hands. "I received this today, delivered by private post." It was addressed in a careful hand. I opened it and read, "Mr. Holmes, thank you for preserving what needed to be preserved. My uncle believed truth should shine on its own, given the right conditions. He was right. I am grateful you allowed the clock to strike without interference. Yours." LHI looked up slowly. "She knew," I whispered. "She knew everything," Holmes replied. "And she kept her silence not from fear, but strategy." He walked to the mantel and checked his watch. "Midnight," he said. The clock above the fireplace struck 12, each chime falling like a curtain. Only 12. No more. Holmes smiled faintly. "There are some crimes, Watson, that begin in shadows but end in clarity. This was one." I closed the letter and placed it beside my notebook. "And some truths," I added, "are louder in silence than in speech." We stood in companionable quiet as the last chime faded, and in that moment I understood the full shape of the case. Not just a murder, not just a deception, but a slow unfolding of quiet intelligence across generations, across time. The case of the clock that tickled midnight twice had ended, not with arrest or gunfire, but with truth striking clean through lies, like the clear sound of a bell in the night. And it had struck exactly on time.